Okay.
Right, there we go. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this information video about a chat that we're having between us. So, I'm Anna Maria. I'm a physiotherapist, and I specialize in Pilates and musculoskeletal injuries. And then there's Katie, who's a women's health and Pilates instructor like me, and does a lot of women's health physiotherapy as well. And there's Bill, who's does a lot of men and women's pelvic health, as well as have been teaching and doing a lot of stuff over the past millions of years, right?
Too many, too many.
Too many years. Right. So today I thought we'd get all of our expertise together to just give you an idea about why it's so important to take care of your body prior to doing any kind of winter sports, because it's really, really important. We see a lot of skiing, snowboarding, cross country skiing, anything related to winter activities, injuries, especially during winter. And we'd really like to highlight the reason why. Now, I'll kick it off by just giving you an idea about where it sits, winter sports with musculoskeletal injuries. And when we talk about musculoskeletal injuries, it's injuries to do with bones, muscles, ligaments in our bodies. It's actually been going down. The latest research has shown that it's less than the previous decades, but the majority of injuries are still primarily 30 to 50% of them in the knee. So we get lots of knee injuries, and it's mainly to do because of the twisting mechanism and the rotational forces that obviously the unstable surface of snow or sleet or ice will do to our bodies. And if they're not prepared, there's too high of a force, and it's going to happen anyways. We get also that's the skiing, but we also get lots of hands and upper limb injuries from snowboarding because of the way they land, and lots of back pain and lots of strains because of fatigue. Because some of it comes actually from the way the body is loaded through the different directions and the way it's been subjected to the unstable surfaces of the ice, but also because of fatigue. Because a lot of people, I like to say this to my patients, but they actually do it. No one would really run a marathon without training, but people would actually go snow skiing and without actually training. And if I see it in Malta, where I am at the moment, it's like their annual holiday. So they don't really practice any skiing, and then they go once a year, and then they expect that they'll have nothing coming back injury wise. So I always try and tell them, like, listen, you kind of need to look at it as the same way as you'd look at trying to train for a marathon, maybe on a lesser scale, but you're not going to go from nothing to a week of skiing because your body's going to end up having some kind of injury in some sort of way. So, the main risk factors that I normally would say, and that's been mostly reported in the latest research, is because you get fatigue mostly even day two, and you've got delayed onset muscle soreness within the third day, and that obviously makes for a big bad, like, kind of hang in your body that it doesn't help you at all. You will get because you won't be trained before, you get poor loading mechanisms, and because you don't know the skill just yet, you're trying to learn it again, the mechanisms will be quite hard on your body, and it's trying to adapt, so it doesn't help. If you have weak abductors or external rotators of the hips, or if you have already a predisposing factor such as back pain or pelvic issues or hip and knee issues that are already existing, those make it even worse for you. So that's even more of a reason for you to train before you go. And of course, then there are the little things that I think you always need to look at, which is stiffness in your body, especially if you tend to have like a sedentary kind of job and not exercise at all. That's going to really affect the way your forces are transferred from the body onto the lower limbs, and the equipment. So I'm sure Bill and Katie will have something to say about the really tight clothing when it comes to pelvic floor and pelvic health. But I look at it in a way that a lot of people will generally buy clothing that they never wear the rest of the year for that specific holiday. And then they'll end up, the actual equipment, the actual clothing is actually quite stiff and puffy and tight. So it's going to restrict your movement anyways. So if you actually have already restrictive stiffness in your body, and then you add on this equipment, things you need to be aware of is that you find comfortable clothing. Don't go for the cheapest thing unless it's the right thing for you, that gives you some kind of movement and leeway in your body to be able to respond to forces in your body and lessen the impact on the rest of the joints. Um, I also want to say, like, the boots that people wear can tend to be quite heavy, and getting them to walk, that's quite a big impact on the knee and the hip and the back. So imagine all of these things and never having to have any sort of conditioning to your body prior to going. So I feel like most of these things have been mentioned over and over again in the risk factors to why people get injured, and equipment having been one of the highest ones. If you equipment when it comes to clothing, but if you actually rent it, you can't really do anything about it, but you can get training for it. You can get someone to show you how to use it, which will really help. The last thing is obviously the way you train. So a lot of people would be telling me, okay, so I've been coming to Pilates for twice a week, the same classes, the same instructor, the same training over and over again, but I still got injured. Yes, but you probably didn't train your. Let's start from the fact that your body probably got used to what you're doing, and now you're doing something different. So what I would say there is potentially changing into not just doing one kind of thing for your body. And this is one of the things that they mention in the research, is that people aren't training their body in the quick movements, like we call it eccentric concentric reactions of the muscles, and like when they go fast and then they go slow. And these are things that normally people don't train much. And unless you do like a dynamic kind of class, whether that's strength, Pilates, or whatever it is, your body won't be used to it. And this is something that in skiing or winter sports, it's really, really important. So those are the key things that I've listed from the main research that's been coming out recently. And although, yes, as I said, injuries are going down, the type of injuries are still quite predominantly high and quite significant. And then the recovery obviously is going to take longer. So I'm going to pass it on to Katie just to go over a little bit of the postnatal, of course, like kind of period, and into pelvic health and women's health, and how that's going to relate to um, what I just said as well.
Exactly. Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the postnatal period and skiing, and I'm delighted to be sharing this platform with you both, and Bill, who is a guru in pelvic health. So who is taking their little one skiing this year? And if you are, I imagine you haven't really thought about your pelvic health when skiing. I imagine it's probably not top of your agenda in your priority list of your planning, but it should be, especially if you've not long had a baby. So we're going to talk about how to prepare your pelvic health from that point of view, from a postnatal point of view. Now, there isn't a huge amount of research in skiing in the postnatal period, but we are getting, thanks to all the amazing, incredible researchers we have now in pelvic health, we've got some excellent emerging research into return to running, elite sport, and high impact sport. And skiing falls into that high impact sport. And we also need to understand that women aren't small men. We're physiologically different, and especially after having a baby. We've got hormones, we've got to think about our bone health, our pelvic floor recovery, and all of these things influence how we move and how we perform on the slopes. So, as mentioned, skiing and snowboarding, they're not gentle activities. They're involved in lots of constant trunk rotations, eccentric loading, quick changes of direction, as Anna has already talked about. So regardless of whatever birth you've had, the pelvic floor, your abdominals, they're all recovering, and probably for at least 6 months. if not longer. And they need to be able to absorb the impact. So we're asking a lot of these structures, and they may not be ready for this. So we need to understand our bodies and understand if they are ready for this or not. And we need an individualized approach. So it's not a case of timeframes and all kind of the evidence with our return to running and elite sports. It's more we're thinking about a criteria-led approach rather than a specific time frame, and thinking about our symptoms as opposed to a specific time frame to getting back to skiing. So firstly, let's talk one thing that I really want, which I always like talking about in the postnatal period and it gets overlooked, is our bone health. So during pregnancy and breastfeeding, and we talked about this last month, we see a dip and reduction in our bone density. And this is a normal physiological response, and it does recover after birth. And it usually takes, depending on whether we're breastfeeding or not, 6 to 12 months. But some women, it can take up to 19 months or even longer than that. So we need to think about ways to help protect our bone health with added calcium, vitamin D, a good diet, and then progressive strength training and progressive loading for our bones as well. And then if you add that in with the interrupted sleep, breastfeeding, which you talk about, lower energy, and then adding that with our winter sports, so the vibrations, the perturbations, all of that will have a significant impact on our bone health. Then coming onto our pelvic floor, so we could probably talk, and I'm sure Bill would agree, we could talk all day, if not all week, about our pelvic floor. So we're not going to go into too much detail about it here. But one of the biggest things I say to women every single day is our pelvic floor is like any other muscle, and we have to treat it like any other muscle. And it's so important, especially with skiing and things, because like the pelvic floor, part of the pelvic floor has the same attachment as some of the muscles for the hips. And one of the pelvic floor muscles is actually a hip muscle as well. It helps to mobilize and rotate the hip. So we have to think of our pelvic floor as it's intertwined with everything we do in our body, and we overlook it all the time. And we know from multiple studies that high impact sports can increase urinary incontinence, whether you've had a baby or not. Now, we're not talking about elite sports here. We're talking about going skiing, but that is a high impact, probably every single day for over a week. And we have to think about, and if we haven't done any of that impact prior, then it might increase our symptoms. So essentially, the pelvic floor needs to be 4 things. It isn't just being strong. It needs to be strong. It needs to be flexible. It needs to co-contract with other muscles and also with our breathing. And it needs good endurance. And you might get symptoms in one or any of these. And I see women quite a lot who have no pelvic floor symptoms. And then when they add that co-contraction or the endurance, such as walking or running, that's when they then get the symptoms. So things that we need to think about is, do you have leakage with coughing and sneezing? Or, as I said, for kind of long periods of walking, do you get any perineal pelvic floor pain? Do you get any kind of sensation of dragging or heaviness? And if you do, then that's fine. It's not an issue, but we need to understand it so that then we can help it and then protect it and build up it's a sign that something's not quite right within the pelvic floor, and that actually it just needs that little bit of extra support. So we need to make sure before going skiing, ultimately, that we can walk that it's functional, that the pelvic floor is functional, that we can walk for kind of 30 or so minutes without any symptoms, that we can squat without feeling any kind of heaviness or dragging or leakage, and along with a multitude of other things. But these are all key things that will help the pelvic floor if we want to kind of get back to skiing. And I think the most important thing which I said is it's not necessarily about time. It's about, can you do certain things without getting any symptoms? And when you are on the slopes, starting small and building up gradually, shorter sessions, easier terrains, and then progressing on each time. And I would say most importantly is be kind to yourself, give yourself time and progressively load it, and then get back to doing what you love with your family. And then I'll pass over to Bill.
Thanks, Katie. That was brilliant. I think you absolutely nailed it. So I think those are the things that we need to be thinking about. I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball out and talk a little bit about something that I surprised me way back from the Beijing Olympics 2022. And there was a guy there with a condition called polar penis. And he was a Finn and he was a cross-country skier. And he was called Remy Lindholm. And he was an experienced cross-country skier who developed because he was in that race where you ski for a bit, then lie in the snow, shoot a gun, and then stand back. And he actually got frostbite on his willy. And, and he had to withdraw from the competition. So in men's, if we're looking at different levels of people that are doing stuff, it's an interesting story. It's kind of stuck in my mind from. I had to go look up his name because I couldn't remember his name, but I did remember the story. So I thought, so rather than just repeat the same things that you were talking about, what I thought I'd talk about are kind of things like why winter sports influence pelvic health. So the biggest thing for me is obviously cold and just physiological change. So cold increases bladder activity. You get more urgency, frequency if you have those symptoms. Again, we also in the cold we're a bit sympathetically driven. So we're kind of like we know if we lie down in the cold we might die of hypothermia. So although we're out there having fun, it is a dangerous place and you need to look out for yourself. So we have higher resting pelvic tone, exacerbates pelvic pain or even functional obstruction with a bowel function. The other thing that happens in the hills is that we tend to become dehydrated because we drink less in the cold. We don't actually think we're thirsty, so we get a concentrated urine, and that could irritate your bladder, give you urgency. I think the way that skiers, so things like skiers and snowboarders often put, they go into postures like skiers with in boots. It limits your ankle dorsiflexion, so it means you have to anchor your pelvic tilt more. If you're a snowboarder, you're in a kind of an oblique position with strain through your pelvic ring, strain through your abdominals, one foot in front of the other, and that probably increases pelvic floor muscle co-contraction, I reckon, maybe elevating baseline tone. Now, I'm saying this because this is just what I think. There is not much evidence to look at this really at all, but I think it's helpful for performance to be in those positions, but it's problematic for overactive pelvic floors, chronic pelvic pain type symptoms, postnatal athletes, and also people with stress urinary incontinence. And then, of course, you already mentioned, Katie, things like moguls, jumps. If you're skating, even if you go away from skiing, skating impact, repetitive loading through the pelvic floor. And then you've got high speed eccentric forces that challenge continence because in the pelvic floor, we often tend to do a lot of concentric squeezing, but we tend not to load that paying out and long lengthening of muscles that we need to get happen. And that is often a big thing that happens in skiing. And then, of course, falls and trauma, direct perineal compression. If you're lying on a soft snow or ice, snowboarders, hockey players, ice skaters, going again away from the skiing kind of arena. And I think, especially, and I'm going to talk a little bit about men because you kind of I'm focused on women. I'm going to say like men, they can often get pudendal irritation from prolonged sitting on lifts that are really hard without cushions, chronic pelvic pain worsened by the cold, or even overuse of hip flexors, like you mentioned as well, Katie, how the hip and the pelvis is really very, very closely connected together. And then I guess post-prostatectomy surgery athletes, they have continence challenges with impact and abdominal pressure, with maybe like some of the gear that they wear with belts around their waist, or maybe they're wearing a bum bag, or maybe they've got a backpack on. So I think high pelvic cord, you get hip pelvic floor coordination deficits with groin pain, adductor strains, SIJ pain symptoms. You get this guarding pattern. And actually, maybe at the beginning of the week, that's okay. But after 4 or 5 days of doing that, and then actually maybe not going home and stretching, going for a bit of après ski, maybe walking home in your boots and sliding about and landing on your bum a few times. the other thing that happens is they often tend to then maybe they're away, their bowels don't like travel, so they have different food, different water, so they maybe get a bit constipated and they have incomplete emptying, and that whole thing kind of ties together. I think one of the things I did want to say though is, and so if you're talking to athletes, maybe, or people that are, and a lot of skiers are quite competitive. So even if you're talking to non-competitive skiers that want to just be better, how do you get them to go, well, why, I'm just going to do my quads and my hamstrings. Why would I want to do my pelvic floor? And I'll say, well, if we can get your pelvic floor and optimize the function, we can maybe improve your ability to edge with skiing and snowboarding through improved hip pelvis association, increased power transfer and skating stride maybe, or if you're a cross country skier, and look at more efficient breathing mechanics as altitude gets makes breathing a bit more difficult. Also, reduce trunk stiffness, improve rotational control and landings, those kind of things. So I think kind of management strategies for me are things like give them kind of specific things that they can do easily, because if you give them too many difficult things to do, they're not going to do them. So I'll say things like deep breathing, diaphragm with posterior rib expansion, and you can kind of do that leaning forward in your pose in a bit of a hip flex posture. Pelvic mobility, tilts, circles, pelvic clock, hip rotator activation, gentle pelvic floor down training if they're overactive, and they can be incorporated into standing up positions really easily. And then things like, what are you doing before you go? Are you working on your dynamic trunk control instead of this constant bracing? So add in rotational eccentric work, landing mechanics. If you're going to be doing moguls and jumps and through the woods, how are you taking off? How are you landing? What's your ankle knee loading like before trunk? Load your ankles and your knees before trunk compression. And then strength and conditioning for me are things like glute med max, adductor synergy, eccentric lower limb strength, hamstring squats, calves, the usual kind of stuff. Um, for overactive pelvic floor people, what I tend to do is I'll ask them to go and buy plug-in heat up pants. So go and get some pants that will act like pocket warmers that you can actually wear around your pelvic floor that will heat you up and keep and stop you getting cold. Because with these guys, often if you don't warm up, once you're cold and once you're overactive, it's really hard to switch that off when you're on the slopes, unless you go and have a few Glühwein, and then that gives the problem because then you're going to the toilet more often. So I think maintain fluid intake as usual during sport. Use hand warmers. Make sure you've got decent kit on that keeps your core temperature up as well. And then even putting like pocket warmers over your abdomen can be quite useful. Make sure you go for the toilet before you go for a long run. I mean, you can pee anywhere on the slopes, but it's really hard to get the kit off to get the your willy out to actually have a pee. It's really tough to do that. So I think just educate that your pelvic floor is part of your core. Cold impact embracing will change how it behaves, and train mobility, timing, strength, not just force. And usually your symptoms will improve when your performance goes up, and that's my kind of thing to get them to buy in. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I think if I had to summarize what you had to say is that everything you said we can do in Pilates basically, because
Yeah,
we do all
100%.
of those.
And
We
I think
do all of
Pilates is
those, to
really
be fair.
useful from Pilates is brilliant because especially equipment Pilates is really useful for the loading component and the eccentric
Yeah.
component. And I think that timing, jump boards on the reformer can be there's not very many modes of exercise out there that actually like replicate that in such
No.
a kind of functional way. So I think that yeah, and certainly from a pelvic floor. I'll say this to patients that I've been thinking recently about pelvic floor and this idea that it lives in this salient part of our brain that is driven completely subconsciously. And then we have to drag it in to this conscious arena to make it work. And so Pilates has got this brilliant way of, let's say there's three or four dimensions, it removes a couple. So you can actually bring the live salient experience into conscious salience, and you get adaptation of that system. But it does it because you don't have to worry. Let's say if you're lying flat on your back on a reformer, because you don't have to worry about the other planes of motion. They're all stabilized. You're lying flat. And so it makes it that you can actually focus on that vertical load, if you like, in that horizontal plane that gives you a really, there's not many places that you can go that reduce it, especially postpartum, postnatal, post-operation, whatever, to load it in that controlled way.
Yes, and it's also like the core thing of Pilates is mind body control, and you have to actually focus and forget about everything else. And it's not about like how much are you going to lift and how much you're going to push and whatever. You just really need to control, and it actually encapsulates the three main things that you need, which is strength, neuromuscular control, and flexibility, which are the three main things that you actually need to help improve your technique and actually help improve all of the symptoms that you mentioned. Like, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. But what I was going to say is that it actually addresses all of the components of your body. So it goes into the upper body and how it links into the pelvis, into the lower body, how it's transferred with your breathing, with your contraction, with your slow, fast movement, everything. So I'm a huge advocate for Pilates, and I'm a bit biased, it's true. But I'm also one that I know that your body needs certain things. So I've been more inclined in saying have a combination of Pilates and strength. And one of the things that people have asked me was how long before should they train and prep prior to going? And I know Katie, and both you and Katie have touched upon it. And it's not about timeline, it's about what you can do. And I believe it's similar, although a lot of research would tell you like try 6 to 8 weeks before. And I think that stems from neuromuscular control because you won't get it immediately. You'll get some neural changes initially, which are temporary, but permanently you'll get them a little bit later on through repetition. So I would tend to want to say, don't leave it a week before, but at least try a couple of weeks before. But it's all about when you can get the task. So for in a musculoskeletal point of view, I would say like if you can single knee bend. So like if you can bend with control on a single knee and you control your knee and your hip when you're doing it. And Katie, you mentioned a few other things when you're squatting and the symptoms that you're feeling. So it is more like a checklist of movements that you could do, but obviously don't leave it to the last minute because, as I said, you kind of need to prep a little bit your body. But these are really good tips from both of you. So thank you.
Yeah, I think the main thing is it's completely individualized, and if somebody doesn't have any symptoms, you still need to prepare your body for that kind of that load and being able to absorb the impact on your pelvic floor and your other muscles. But I think it's completely individualized about how long you should be preparing before, or depending on what or whether you have any symptoms or not, and how you're going to rehab those progressively.
Absolutely. And of course, if you don't manage to get any of this done before and you get symptoms after, absolutely just seek help because you don't need, like if you'd seek help for an ankle sprain or a knee sprain, you'd seek help for pelvic floor issues. So there's always help after. And I wanted to say this sentence because it really, really made sense before. And I'm really glad I wrote it down. And because it came, like one of the papers wrote that most ski injuries are preventable. Because if you work on strength, that gives you capacity. If you work on control, that gives you safety. If you work on breath plus timing, that helps you absorb all the forces that winter sports throws at you. So really and truly just really focusing on strength, control, technique, warming up, things you can do on the snow and even at the hotel. Really easy, quick routines that you can do. You can find loads of those, and I can do some quick links even when we do the caption in the YouTube page. And yes, I think you should have all the resources.
I think
and
one
all.
quick thing I would say is this.
Yeah.
I think if we're talking about women's health and women's pelvic floor, it's hard being a woman. And actually, we gaslight them all the time, and we say things like we do say things like, "Have you done your pelvic floor exercise today?" And Katie and I could speak about that all day because I find it just kind of like, well, no, like I haven't done my biceps exercises today or my triceps because I'm
Absolutely.
too
Couldn't agree
bloody
more.
busy and I have no time. So, but actually, I'm still not leaking, and actually, my symptoms are still not worse. So, in actual fact, the reason that you didn't get to do it, it doesn't matter because as long as you get back to it at some point, and I think you don't need to be going to the gym 5 times a week, you don't need to be training it. You can do all of these things in the house with things you find lying around. Put water bottles in a backpack, leave it in the corner. Make it a game with the kids. Use the kids as weights. Do stuff that actually is fun because in actual fact, you know, like actually doing squats with a kid is much closer to probably squatting and skiing than actually doing legit weights in the gym because in weights in the gym the weights don't move. When you're on the snow, everything is moving, everything is really dynamic. And I always say things to women like, look, I've stopped telling my all of my pelvic floor, and can I say this? Yeah, I'm going to say it anyway. I've stopped telling all of my pelvic floor patients to do their exercises every day because
I do too. Completely
yeah,
agree.
because they don't, number one, and then they feel that they've failed, number two, and then they get gaslit because they haven't done them. And I'll go, look, these are striated muscles. Striated muscles, we need to work them. We need to follow strength and conditioning principles that have been put out there by the wonderful people like Claire Minishaw. And we need to say, look, apply these conditions, which means you don't do them every day, because if you've worked them to fatigue, you can't do them every day because they're too tired. So you need to give them recovery so that we
Yep.
get a proper change in the muscle strength. So anyway, sorry, rabbiting on. This is my political rant about this, but I think, and I hope, and perhaps in maybe 4 or 5 years' time, where that's the thread. That's what we're saying. We don't need to be doing this every day. We need to work
No.
them fatigue. We need to progress them, and we need to get them. We need to be specific about how we train them, but it doesn't mean that you have to go to a gym, and it doesn't mean you have to spend lots of money to be a member of a gym, and it doesn't mean you just have to say, well, what do I want to do, right? So what does that involve? Think about common sense wise, and how can I make that happen in my house? And off you go. And
Yeah.
then
And
skiing,
change the stimulation, as you said, like it
100%.
doesn't
Yeah,
make sense
stress
doing
it.
the same thing over and over again.
No, it
So
doesn't.
yes,
Agree
thank you
more.
both. I do loved having
Definitely.
you and hope to see you again
Thank you very
another time.
much.
But if anyone sees this and have any questions, please just drop us a message, an email, or whatever you have, and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye bye.
Bye.